Good evening and Happy New Year. Welcome to another edition of Real Talk with Michelle. Now, if you've been watching the show, you know that Real Talk is a show that will continue to uplift and encourage. And this year is no different. We will continue to do so. Our goal this year is to enhance your growth in all areas. 2023, it's a new year. It's a fresh start. So join us, grow with us, and continue to support us. Our guest this evening is Elder David Fraser. David has a passion for ministry, service, and justice. As a former pastor in the South Atlantic Conference, he is an experienced preacher and an ordained elder in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Elder Fraser attended Oakland University, where he graduated with a bachelor's in theology. He also holds a master's degree in forensic psychology, a second master's degree in criminal investigations, and he has been designated as a financial intelligence specialist. He is a decorated sworn law enforcement officer with his advanced law enforcement certification from the Georgia Peace Officer Council. He has formerly held positions of state court deputy marshal, master police officer, detective senior over financial crimes and fraud, and he currently works as a special agent for the Georgia Department of Revenue, where he specializes in tax fraud investigations and crimes committed against the state. Elder Fraser is married to the love of his life, the former Lauren Poole, and they have two wonderful children, Landon and London. Elder Fraser's daily goal is to be a servant to God and a friend to man. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Michelle.
Welcome. It's such a privilege to have you as the first guest for 2023.
Yes, ma'am. It's a privilege to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for agreeing. I invited you to the show because there's so many layers to you. Mm-hmm. There's so many layers to you. And one of the layers that that pulled me in was where I was in the congregation when you preached a sermon. You came to our church and you preached, and you talked about as Christians, being financially stable and having financial wealth. And we all have this thing where, some people feel as Christians that we should just be comfortable and, we shouldn't grow. We shouldn't, take those opportunities that are around us financially. So we're going to cover all of that because in 2023, the goal is just to encourage people to do things differently. And so we're starting the show off just encouraging them to have a new, fresh start financially for 2023. But
Absolutely.
Before we dive into that, let's talk about you a little bit. So Tell me a little bit about you. Tell me a little bit about your background and, where you grew up, and tell me a little bit about your journey.
Okay. Well, I'll start with where I grew up. I was born in Seattle, Washington, but I was mostly raised in Michigan. That's where I spent most of my childhood. And while there, I lived in Kalamazoo. It's a small town, humble beginnings, but I thoroughly enjoyed the time that I spent there, and I made lifelong friendships. From there, as I grew older, I spent most of my life participating in church activities. I was always very active in the church. I was a Pathfinder. I was on the Bible Bowl team. I was always heavily involved in Christian ministry, even from a young age. And I believe I preached my first sermon when I was 8 years old. And when I did, I almost instantaneously started receiving comments and compliments from the elders and the seniors in our church and from family members that I should consider preaching and ultimately pastoral ministry as a calling that I should embark upon for my life.
Okay.
And so probably from that moment forward, many of the moves that I started to make were towards becoming a pastor and ultimately realizing that goal one day. That was on a professional level. On a personal level, I was raised in a single parent home. It was just me, my mother, and my sister growing up. My older sister, who's 5 years older than me. And my mother, who worked very hard to support 2 children in a single parent home, which isn't easy. And so we spent time in various places across the country as my mom moved to pursue better job opportunities and pursue safer neighborhoods for her children in terms of where we lived. And so all in all, it culminated into me becoming a pastor when I got older. And I spent some time there before I transitioned into law enforcement. So that's a general summary.
So tell me a little bit about, I know when you and I talked prior to preparing for the show, you shared with me a little bit about growing up without your father. Tell me a little bit about that, because I know that it affected you, and I know it affected your relationships. So just tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you this. Growing up without my father was a great challenge. More of a challenge than I ever realized as a child. And I'll tell you why. You could probably take 10 adult men, put them in a room and ask each and every single one of them, what does it take to be a real man? And you might get 10 different answers. The reason why is because it's very hard to explain how to be a man. Learning to be a man is something in my experience that is modeled. And so for a young man to learn how to be a man, he just has to have models, role models around him to demonstrate that. And growing up, I didn't have that. And so it affected me deeply. And to be honest with you, I would say first and foremost, it affected my relationships. I've been married, happily married, I can boast, for almost 8 years now. And in being married and even having children, I always thought when I first got married that being a good husband and a good father meant providing for my family. And I still think that that is the core requirement for a good man.
The base.
However, it is just that, as you said, a base. There are many, many more elements involved in being a good father. And I think that where I missed that model in my life was in the small intangibles that come with being a father and a husband. Things like being attentive to your wife's emotional needs. Things like being able to listen to and support your children. Those are all factors that were missing in my life. And so as I began to try and parent my children, and as I strive to be a good husband, it had a negative impact, especially initially during the beginning stages of my marriage and during the beginning stages of my parenting because of that deficit. I think that from an occupational standpoint, I also felt heavily the absence of a father. And I think that that usually manifests for young men in 2 different ways. When young men grow up without a father, typically they either become underachievers or overachievers. Usually what happens is you have a person who can't find their way and just can't find any sort of tangible success. And then you have a person at the opposite end of the spectrum, which overachieves to compensate for the loss. And I was the latter. I spent a lot of time trying to prove myself through my accomplishments. And I spent a lot of time gathering certifications and degrees and working towards various different positions and promotions, all to feel validated. And I think that young men, for them to feel validated in their manhood, they need for a man to call out that value. I didn't have that. And so it wasn't until maybe three years ago, I'd say, that I started to begin to make moves that were based more on my well-being and happiness than in trying to validate myself or prove my worth. And so being 33 years old now, you know, it's crazy that it took until the age of 30 for me to come to a point where I stopped trying to fill the deficits or the holes that were left by an absent father. And so I think that those are mostly the ways that I was affected financially. Well, not financially, but those are the ways that I was affected personally and occupationally.
And it's interesting too, because you also mentioned to me that because of this deficit that you had and because of not having that model, in order to deal with those issues of not having your father around, you went to therapy.
I did.
And so in talking to you about that, it was interesting to me because, especially for Black men, a lot of Black men do not like therapy, whether it's for marriage or just for their own well-being. Tell us a little bit about how that experience was for you and how it enhanced your life and how it helped you.
Well, I can tell you first and foremost, the biggest hurdle was actually going to therapy. I think one of the ways that helped me to get there was remembering an experience that I had when I was in high school. When I was in high school, I used to play varsity basketball. And when I was playing varsity basketball, at one point during that time, I sustained a pretty major sprain to my left ankle. And I wanted to play through it. I wanted to just keep on playing because in our community, strength is always emphasized. And people who take breaks or who sit down, they're often regarded as weak. For me, it was very impactful when my coach came to me and he said, the strength of a man is determined by his ability to heal so that he can come back better.
Wow.
And I realized
That's deep.
I realized that if I wanted to be an effective athlete
and be better,
I had to treat that ankle injury. And so I realized that the first step was acknowledging that the absence of my father, the abandonment that I felt from him, actually led to emotional injuries that had to be treated, and that I could come back better and stronger if I dealt with it. So after I got past that hurdle and I went to go see the therapist, and I was privileged enough to go to a male therapist, and honest to God truth,
real talk.
Yes, honest to God truth, sometimes it's hard to find a good male therapist. The profession is still mostly female dominated today, but I was privileged to go to a male therapist, and because I did so, I believe that he could relate better to me. But I will say that I had an idea about therapy that was incorrect.
Right.
And
as too many.
And that idea, once it was destroyed, it paved the way for my healing. The idea was that if I went to a therapist, he would tell me I was wrong, that I was living my life incorrectly. When I was in graduate school of getting my first master's, my first master's of course is in forensic psychology, and we studied abnormal behavior in one of my classes. And when we dealt with abnormal behavior, we dealt with a concept called cognitive reframing. And what that basically means is getting a person to reframe and refocus their current perspective. It's basically just considering an alternative. Good therapists employ that tactic. They use cognitive reframing to help a person move forward in their life. That's exactly what my therapist did. At the time, I couldn't see what he was doing, but that was the strategy that he was using.
Change the narrative. Yeah.
To change my narrative, to change my perspective. So he didn't say that I was wrong. What he told me was, I understand where you're coming from. Have you considered this perspective as well? And by helping me to shift my focus away from the absence of my father to what I've been able to accomplish without him and who I can be as I continue to move forward in my life, I begin to feel empowered. And so once that stigma was done away with, I was able to really begin the healing process.
You're free. Yeah.
And I would honestly encourage every male who's feeling like they're setting themselves up to be told they're wrong by going to a therapist to reconsider, because it's not about being wrong or right. It's about being well.
Yeah. That's wow. That's some real talk. That's some real talk, because it's there's such a stigma that's attached to it, and or Black men are, they're dying in their own stuff, and they're not refusing to get help for it. So that's some real talk. Now let's talk a little bit about your pastoral journey.
Okay.
So you were raised by your single mom, and I know that when we spoke, this was something that your mom wanted you to do as well. And when you changed careers, it was quite the disappointment. So let's talk a little bit about your pastoral journey and the transition into you becoming a police officer. Share that with us.
Okay. Well, as I stated, I think from a young age, I was almost groomed to be a pastor. From a young age, I was almost groomed to be a pastor. It was something that begun when I was probably about 8. And every time I stood before a congregation, every time I acted in any sort of pastoral capacity, I could feel and see the joy on my mother's face. She is one of those old school Christians that believes that pastoral ministry is sacred. And I think that it gave her a great sense of joy to see her son doing a sacred work. And eventually what happened was that I began to pursue this journey because I didn't want to disappoint her. And I'll tell you something that I've learned as a parent. When you have small children cannot comprehend the concept of God. He's just too big. He's honestly too big for adults to comprehend. But for a child, when they think God, they think their parents. That's their best example. Exactly. And so somewhere along the way, it went from just not wanting to disappoint my mother to not wanting to disappoint God. I felt that was absolutely what he wanted me to do, and that there would be no wavering, and that for me to do so would be the ultimate disappointment for both my mother and for the ruler of the universe. And so it was a difficult experience for me, because even though my heart was in the right place, I always felt like I was physically in the wrong place. Pastoral ministry is a wonderful, wonderful profession. And I agree it's a sacred calling, but it requires a certain type of individual. And I didn't feel that it was conducive to my personality, my preferences, or my skill set. And so I continued down that journey. I went to Oakwood, and that was a great experience. I made a lot of friends, and I learned a lot about the Word of God, and I learned a lot about being a pastor. I transitioned to the South Atlantic Conference, and I was first sent to the West End Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I think that being sent there allowed me to remain in pastoral ministry longer than I might have stayed. I'll tell you this, I heard one great quote, and it said that people do not quit places, they quit other people. When a person leaves a job, they don't leave the place, they leave the people there. I fell in love with the people at West End, and they enabled me to do a job that I didn't really like much longer than I might have been able to do so otherwise. And so I stayed in ministry, and there came a point where South Atlantic came to me and told me that they would be moving me to my own district, because when I was at West End, I was an associate pastor. When I moved to my own district in South Carolina, that was when I got a really heavy taste of pastoral ministry.
Wake up call.
Exactly. And I found myself feeling very unhappy about my work. And I began to question if it was something that I was really supposed to do for the rest of my life. The thing was, I was still operating under the psychology that leaving ministry would disappoint my mother and my God. But I learned something special about God when I was pastoring in South Carolina. I learned that God intends to use all of us and the gifts that he's given us for the glory of his kingdom. However, God wants us to be effective workers in his ministry. The issue is somebody who is miserable or depressed in the concept of their work won't be effective. And so my personal belief is that God wouldn't have somebody to be for a long time in a position that makes them miserable. And when I finally came to that understanding, it gave me the courage to ask, could I do something else? Could I maybe be of better use to God in another position? And that is when I decided to leave. And that was a difficult experience because many of my members felt that I was running from my calling. My boss questioned me. He thought that I was having a nervous breakdown or that I was losing my mind. And my mother, she made it clear in no uncertain terms that she was a little disappointed.
Yeah.
I will say that my mother has continued to be supportive. However, I knew in her heart of hearts where she wanted me to be. But I also recognized that there would come a point in my life where I would have to make my own decisions and live with the consequences, be they good or bad. And so I finally made the decision to leave pastoral ministry in 2016. And that was when I began to transition into law enforcement.
Right. Well, it's amazing that you recognized it so early, that you weren't happy, that you weren't fulfilled, that you weren't being effective, and that you could make that transition so early on. So tell us now about the journey to becoming a police officer. How did you get into law enforcement?
Well, as I was sitting there contemplating what I was going to do with a bachelor's in theology and not much more, because that's all I had at the time, I began to wonder what career options would be available to me. And I began to ask myself, what would make me happy? And I have to say that as a child, the thing that I love more than anything else, I used to read comic books and I love superheroes, and especially Batman. He was my favorite. And I was like, I would love to be able to do something like that. But I had a major reality check a few seconds later when I realized that we don't live in a world where superheroes are real. But I realized in that same breath that we do live in a world where there are heroes, people who step in the line of danger to defend and protect other people. And those heroes come in all different shapes and sizes. Law enforcement officers, firefighters, social workers. There are a lot of people in public service who are protecting and defending individuals who can't protect and defend themselves. For me, the field that jumped out the most was law enforcement. And so I thought about it. I talked with my wife about it, and she was surprisingly supportive. She told me, she said that even though going into law enforcement could be dangerous, I would rather you be in physical danger and be at emotional peace than the latter.
Good. Yeah.
And so, so I decided to give it a try. I applied to several different agencies and I landed in DeKalb County. And that was where I was offered my first position as a police officer. And I have to say that it wasn't everything that I thought it would be. I learned very quickly that, like most professions, TV doesn't do it justice. It's very different when you actually do the work.
Reality sets in.
Absolutely. But I found it to be immediately fulfilling. And I'm glad that I did make that transition. I started out on patrol, and patrol is demanding because it requires you, number one, to respond to various incidents, from domestic violence calls to robberies to burglaries, and the response is often quick. There's not a lot of time for thinking. You really have to react. And not only that, there's a climate in our country about policing that I had to battle past, because when I entered into policing, that was right around the time where there became a shift in how the public really viewed police officers. So I picked an interesting time to go in. But even still, I found the work to be fulfilling, and I pressed on. And I believe that to this day, I've experienced many great rewards from that time I spent on patrol.
Okay. So now that you transitioned into being a police officer, there's so many questions that I have regarding that. You said you transitioned at a time when there was this uproar about police officers. And tell me, just share with us just a little bit, how was the transition being a Christian police officer and during that time?
Well, I believe that being a Christian police officer actually made it even more challenging because I had to practice good officer safety tactics and training, and I had to couple that along with my faith and individual beliefs. And as a Christian, we are not allowed to dismiss legitimate concerns of our brothers and sisters. Sometimes in the field of law enforcement, I meet officers who hear the complaints of the people that they work for and they dismiss it. they act as though it's not legitimate or like it doesn't matter. But as a Christian, you can't think that way.
Right.
At least you're not supposed to.
Right.
And so I had to balance the ability to do my job and the ability to police with my faith.
Yeah.
And that was a unique challenge. I think that I can best sum it up in this way. I learned that the best way to change or to bring about change is from within.
True.
When you are in a position, that's probably the best opportunity that you have to make a change concerning that position. I can recall one time I was conducting a traffic stop and I pulled over a man and his family for running a red light. And I had no intention. From the start, I had decided I was going to give them a warning. But when I got to the vehicle, they were very upset, very combative. And he stated that I was selling out, that I wasn't supporting the black community by pulling him over. He had begun to record me. And it very quickly was escalating into an emotional circumstance because he was refusing to cooperate. He refused to give me his driver's license. And I have seen how some of the officers that I've worked with would have responded to that situation. They might have pulled him out the car. He might have gotten into an altercation. Exactly. And so what I did was I understood that his family was watching, and I understood that he was obviously afraid. And I told him, I said, I need you to step out of the vehicle. And I pulled him to the back of the vehicle. And I said, hey, what are you doing? I said, why are you putting your family at risk like this? We're on the side of the road. I said, listen, I said, first of all, my intention was to give you a warning. But more importantly, I said, what I need you to understand is that if you cooperate, it can go so much further. I said, even if I were to write you a ticket, giving you a ticket doesn't mean you're guilty. It means I'm accusing you. And you can exercise your right to go to court and defend yourself. But not here, not on the side of the road. Most of the time, the only thing that can result in is a physical altercation or an arrest. And he told me, he said, I've handled this incorrectly, and I apologize.
He had that preconceived idea of what a police officer was and is, and when they get approached, they already have that in their mind. So it became And so he said that more than anything else, he appreciated that I talked to him and I explained to him what was going on, and I said. Being able to do that means having the background that I have, growing up around people who look like me and act like me, understanding what it means to be black in America. And so I realized in that moment and in many other moments that I could affect change by being inside and being an agent for good in my police department. And so I think that was part of the validation process for me in my journey of being a police officer. Wow, that's so true. We all have this idea, good or bad, whether it be good or bad, about police officers, and you just taking that time, that Christian moment, because
Absolutely.
that could have ended so differently.
It could have,
and the circumstances could have been so different. So now let's get into the financial aspect of the show.
Okay.
Let's talk about your current position.
Okay.
With the Georgia Department of Revenue.
Absolutely.
Right? Let's talk about what you do there, and I also want to talk about some financial tips. You mentioned some time ago that you and your wife struggled financially.
Absolutely.
And you mentioned paying off your school loans and your car, and so share with us what you do. Share with us that journey about your financial struggle in your family and how you came out of that.
Well, I cultivated an interest in finance when I became a detective over fraud for the police department that I was working with. I was approached by a supervisor and he said, hey, I get a good feeling about you from the way that you write and from your educational background. And I think that you could best serve this department by being a detective. While being a detective, I worked on a couple of different task force, and I ended up meeting some agents from the Georgia Department of Revenue, and I was essentially recruited to come to that agency. now I function as a special agent, which is just a fancy way of saying criminal investigator. I investigate crimes against the state of Georgia related to tax fraud, tax evasion, and sometimes specific tax crimes like bank fraud and things of that nature, money laundering, etc. What I learned is that as I've looked at these cases, and now my victim is usually the state that I'm working for, but when I was working on the local level before I went to the state, most of my victims were individuals. And what I learned that a lot of times their money was taken or their money was lost, and there were things that they could have done to protect their money. And then I took it a step further and realized that there were things that they could have done not only to protect their money, but to grow their money. And I had to take a hard look inside and realize that I had actually made many of the mistakes that I was learning about. Number one, I wasn't doing a good job of securing my money. But number two, I wasn't doing a good job of setting up assets for the future. When I first transitioned from pastoral ministry to policing, a lot of people think that pastors don't make good money. Pastors are paid pretty decently.
Yeah?
Yes, absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah, pretty decently. Not enough, to be wealthy, but
be comfortable.
But pretty well to be comfortable.
Okay.
And so when I left,
that's funny because we all have this idea that you guys are not paid well.
Absolutely. When I left pastoral ministry and went into policing, I initially took probably a $30,000 or $40,000 pay cut, and I had so much faith in the Lord that I believed that it wouldn't be a problem, and I was wrong. I wasn't wrong about my faith. Right. But I was wrong about the finance. I was. And so I learned very quickly what it meant to struggle financially and to not know how I was going to pay my next bill and to go without. And it was a big struggle, especially for a man leading his family and supporting his family. Yeah. And so that experience, coupled with the knowledge that I gained from investigating crime, taught me some financial principles. And what I've done is I've tried to make it my business to share the knowledge that I've gained with other people. And in sharing that knowledge, I'll tell you that I think that most of the time where we mess up as Christians and even as people is that we don't understand that finance is usually a double-edged sword. There's usually two blades associated with it. And most of the times we've only focused on one blade in our lives. And so what has helped me to begun to build wealth is to focus on what I call the three financial swords. And the first financial sword is the double edge of budgeting versus planning. Most of us budget. Most of us know exactly what we make, and we try to figure out, for the most part, how we're going to spend that money. But in order for a budget to be successful, you also have to have the second part of the blade, which is financial planning. And so financial planning is different from budgeting, because budgeting basically just states how you're going to allot your money. Financial planning, exactly how you're going to spend it. Financial planning, on the other hand, deals with your plans for where you want to be down the road. It dictates how you budget your money. And so if you don't have a financial plan, then your budget is worthless. It's basically why some people continue to live paycheck to paycheck. Absolutely. And so what I've learned is I've had to ask myself, where do you want to be in 2 years, 5 years, in 10 years financially? And how does your budget reflect that desire? Because if it doesn't, you're not actually budgeting. Absolutely. You're just keeping track of your expenses. Exactly.
You're just basically surviving.
You're surviving. And so that's the first sword that I realized I had to start wielding in my journey. Now, the second sword is a little bit trickier. And that sword is balancing saving versus investing. Saving versus investing. Pretty much everybody I know saves a little money. Saving is
that can be debatable.
That's true.
That can be debatable. The field that I'm in bankruptcy, a lot of people again are living paycheck to paycheck, and a lot of people, you'd be surprised, have no savings at all.
No savings.
So when these situations happen, or when the rainy day comes, or when the loss of job comes, or when the illness comes, there's nothing to fall back on. So that's debatable.
Yeah, it is. I think that at least now we're starting to come to a point where we understand that saving is important.
It is. Absolutely.
Granted, that doesn't mean that everybody's doing it.
Yeah.
But I will say this, there's a misconception that if you save, you can build wealth. And saving is usually not enough to build wealth.
Absolutely.
And the reason why is because most of us don't make enough money to set aside enough money
Absolutely.
to save. Most of us make enough to pay our bills.
Right, because if you're already living paycheck to paycheck, there's nothing to save.
Exactly,
Right.
not a lot more.
Right.
And so the only way that a person can continue to build wealth is by capturing the other aspect of the blade, which is investing. And that is a concept that I think scares a lot of people because when they think investing, they think risk. They think my money could be lost.
Absolutely.
Not every investment is a great risk. For example, a common investment that a lot of people don't often think of as an investment is owning a home. Every year when you own a home, you are building equity on that home. Equity that you can cash into later. That's just one investment that you can make that doesn't have to be cryptocurrency or stocks. And those are good investments too. But just one investment that you can make. The other types of investments that I've seen are specialized accounts, and they have all different kinds of specialized
IRAs
accounts.
and stuff.
Exactly.
IRAs.
But those accounts, some of them get you in a situation where you're forced to both save and invest.
Absolutely.
Because you can't immediately access the money that you put in. So for people who are not disciplined, that's a valuable way to invest.
Absolutely.
And the only issue that you can run into is that you might come to a point where you might need some money and you can't access it. But again, it goes back to what you were saying. It also comes down to financial planning and making sure that you do have some money set aside for an emergency or for a rainy day.
And I don't mean to cut you, but in terms of savings, let's go back a little bit, because tell our viewers how to save, because I think people feel like if I don't have $500 to save, then it doesn't make sense for me to save. I think, you start small and you build up.
Absolutely.
And it builds.
Absolutely.
So just touch on that a little bit. Tell them how to start saving.
Well, there are two different camps about saving, and I think that both of them can be effective. One strategy is to save a little here and a little there, and it works. It's been working for thousands of years. I go back to the biblical story of Joseph in Egypt before the famine, and he told Pharaoh to set aside a fifth of the grain. A fifth is not a lot of money or a lot of grain in that case, but it was enough to sustain them for 7 years. Once they got into famine.
Absolutely.
I think that sometimes people don't understand the value of even putting aside $5 or $6 a month. What that can do for you. Especially if you're putting it into an account that's building interest. There is another strategy for saving that I think that it requires a little bit more discipline. But what it does is it's called the funnel approach. And how it works is you pick a goal that you have or that you're saving towards, such as a car or a down payment on a home, and you funnel funds that you would use for maybe frivolous activities or things that are not necessities.
Starbucks.
Exactly. You funnel those funds into that goal. And it's not for a long time. It's for a short period of time. But by doing so, you can reach your goal faster. Once that goal is reached, then you set your sights on the next goal. And so that approach takes going without. And that approach is a little bit more difficult because of it. However, I've used that approach in my life several times, and it's worked. It's enabled me to pay off credit card debt. It's enabled me to pay off other expenses that me and my family have. We paid off 2 car notes, and at the time we were living off $48,000. It's not a lot of money to pay off 2 car notes, but we did so because we decided that for a period we were going to go without. And so I think that is important, balancing the blade of saving versus investing. And then the last blade, the blade that I live by the most, and it's acting versus education. And this one was a brand new one for me, but it's turned out to be one of the most important aspects of finances. I've learned that most of us, when I say acting, I mean most of us go through the motions of spending money. We all do that. But not a lot of us have a lot of education about how we should manage our money. And it's crazy because most of us are managing large budgets. And I've heard people laugh at me about that. But let's break it down for a moment. Let's say that right now you make $50,000 a year. And let's say that you live paycheck to paycheck. What that means is that every year you are the financial officer, the chief financial officer of that $50,000.
Right.
You are the financial manager of that budget.
Yeah.
Most companies wouldn't hire you to manage that money because they don't think you have the education that's needed to do it. Exactly. But yet and still, we continue to manage these large budgets without any knowledge of how to do so. What I've had to do is I've had to go back and ask myself, what can you do to learn more about money and the principles behind it? And so I took a basic accounting class. I read some books on finance. I don't by any means consider myself to be an expert, but I understand a little bit better now about how money works. And once you do, you can realize how much of it is wasted or lost. There are people who pay $400-$500 a year to get their taxes filed. And I have talked to multiple accountants who have said that it is so insanely easy that you could literally go online and print out a form and sit there for an hour and complete it if you understood what you were reading. They said that the only people, I had one accountant tell me, he said the only person that really needs an accountant is a person who owns a business. He said once you get into the business side of accounting, it's more complicated. But he said for an individual or for a family, he said it's very simple, but people spend thousands every year on that.
And it goes back to not being educated and not taking the time to want to know how to do it or to take the time to learn how to do it.
Exactly. And so what I've had to ask myself is, what can you do to learn more about saving and about building income? I have found that there is a lot of different principles that can be applied to managing finances and ultimately growing wealth. One thing that I learned when I had a discussion with an accountant who was kind of helping me to go over some financial principles that I could apply in my own life, I was looking to set up a small business, and he stated to me, he said, well, how are you going to classify your business? I said, well, what do you mean? He said, if you do not classify your business, the IRS will classify it for you, and they will pick the most expensive classification so that they can get more tax money out of you. He said that a lot of times the way that wealthy people continue to build wealth is that they understand where there are loopholes that they can operate within. One principle that I learned, and I'll end with this, one principle that I learned in investigating tax evasion is that there are legal ways to pay less taxes. There are many, many things that people do that enable them to pay less and keep more money in their pockets. That's not the same as lying on your taxes. That's a crime.
Yes,
However, there are a lot of loopholes and write-offs that people simply don't know about. And so for me, again, I can't emphasize more than this, the importance of learning how to act with knowledge. And so if you take those three swords and you wield them, I believe that you can be in a much better financial place.
That's amazing. Now tell me how, that was some good information, really good information. How do people react? Not people. Let me rephrase that. How do you find the church reacts to you coming in and preaching the financial message? How do they take it? Because especially some of our older people, they're like, you're not supposed to do this and you're not supposed to do that. And how is it received?
Well, in my experience, not always well. There's a camp of thought in the Christian church, and I'm going to be specific and say more so in the Adventist church. There is a camp of thought that Christians are supposed to be pious. And by pious, that means they're not supposed to have anything.
Right. You're supposed to just be,
And the idea is that is because when Jesus was on earth, Jesus wasn't very wealthy. He didn't have a lot of money. In fact, the Bible says the Son of Man had no place to lie his head. And I have listened to many sermons from different denominations talking about the idea of wealth and talking about how wealth is a biblical concept. And I've grappled with the principles for a while. And what I have realized is that there's no doubt about it. To conduct effective ministry, money is needed. And absolutely. And I think that oftentimes we sleep on the reality that we can be that much more effective if we have resources. And if you comb the pages of the Word, you'll find that even people who didn't have a lot of money, like Paul, had wealthy benefactors who were donating to his cause, because ministry will always cost. I found that I've been able to be more effective when I'm able to take care of my family and meet my requirements, my bills. When I've been able to do that, I've been able to bless other people even more. I don't think that Christians necessarily have to pursue being rich, but I think that we have a moral and biblical responsibility to pursue financial freedom. Romans 16 talks about owing no man any money. Paul talks about it multiple times in the word, in fact, in his epistles. The idea that God is not in favor of Christians being in debt. It's just a fact. Because when you are in debt, you are a slave to your debtor.
Absolutely. Bankruptcy.
Exactly.
Which is what I do.
Exactly.
Right? It gets rid of the debt. Absolutely. Absolutely.
We, as
the
Christians,
bondage. That
exactly.
bondage. Yeah.
We as Christians are called to be slaves to the Lord,
Yeah.
not to nail net,
Yeah.
not to Sally Mae,
Yeah.
not to the bank.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so the reality
Yeah.
is we have to make those strides so that we can escape that bondage. And I think it's important also because we have a responsibility to our families to take care of them. You know, it's one of those things where I realize that as a man, I have a duty, and a biblical and a God-ordained duty to support my family. And people can debate what it means to support your family. I don't know that it means to spoil your children, but I do believe that it means making sure that our families are taken care of.
Absolutely.
And part of taking care of a family, the Bible says that a man who does not leave an inheritance for his family is worse than an infidel. And I ask myself, am I righteous if I am not leaving an inheritance for my children? And the answer is no. I am worse than an infidel. It's funny that Jesus never called the tax collectors or the people in the Bible who we might classify as sinners. He never said they were worse than infidels. But the person who didn't leave an inheritance for their family was.
Lack of planning.
Exactly. And so I realize I have a responsibility to make sure that when I am gone, that my family is taken care of.
Yeah.
And so even though it wasn't well received, I think it's an idea that the church needs to wake up to.
Absolutely. And this is what 2023 is about. It's about fresh start. It's about doing things differently to get different results. And so that information was so well received. It's so needed. And as we prepare to close, there are two things that I would love to ask you to do. Again, just look into the camera and just kind of go down the steps again as to how to start that road to financial freedom. And after you do that, I would love for you to end the show by giving some advice to the viewers about just going into 2023 prepared, ready to, just walk your journey and walk your path financial free, debt free. So we'll go ahead and do that. But before I let you do that, do you think you're living your purpose?
Absolutely. Yes. I have had to work to find my place in this world and in this life. But I can say that when I wake up in the morning, I'm doing what God wants me to do. It's not always glamorous. It's not always fun. But there's always a sense of peace and satisfaction and knowing that I'm following where he's leading and doing his work. And his work looks different for some. It's not always preaching from a pulpit. But the reality is that all of us can do his work if we walk in the calling that he has for us.
Oh, that's amazing. And you still get the chance to do both. You still get the chance to preach and you still get the chance to do the financial by sharing the knowledge that you have financially with others. So you get
yes.
You get both worlds.
I have been blessed. I can say that. I have been
both
blessed.
Worlds. All right, so as we prepare to close, just give us some steps that we can take with us as we walk into 2023 and also end by just giving some words of advice. You can look into the camera.
So the first step, my friends, my family, is balancing budgeting and financial planning. Make sure that you have a budget in place that allows you to operate and save. And also make sure that you have a financial plan in place that governs and guides your budget. The second step is to make sure that you are balancing saving and investing. It is important to look into how you can find ways to set some money aside for a rainy day. It is also important to make sure that you are allowing your money to work for you. And we do that by investing. It might be looking towards finally becoming a homeowner. It might be looking towards setting up a long-term savings account. It might even be making sure that you have appropriate funds set aside for the future in a investment or a long-term portfolio. But the point is balancing saving and investing. The final step, which is most important, is balancing your spending with your knowledge. As you spend more, your knowledge should also grow more. Take tangible steps to make sure that you understand at least the basic principles of financing and accounting so that you can better manage your household income, your budget, and your future. As we transition into this new year and we move forward, my advice to you all is to remember, don't let anybody tell you that God wants you to be lacking or destitute or to be in debt for the rest of your life. It is not a biblical concept. It is not something that God desires for your life. I believe from the bottom of my heart that God desires that we prosper and we be in good health. And so I encourage you to find ways to be a good steward with what he has already given you. And I also encourage you to remember that who the Son sets free is truly free indeed. That means free from debt, free from the bondage of debt collectors. And so I encourage you all to move forward with those principles and go in God's grace.
Thank you so much. Thank you. What a way to start 2023. Thank you so much. Great words of advice, great information, and thank you so much for agreeing to be a guest on the show.
Not a problem at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my prayer that God will continue to bless you, bless your family, and that he'll continue to use you as you dispense this knowledge and information with us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And to your viewers, thank you for watching. I hope that you are blessed by this episode. I also pray that you will take the information and the steps that have been shared and that you will march forward into 2023. Be willing to embrace it. Be willing to accept it. Again, thank you for watching. If you wish to get in touch with us, reach out to us at realtalkwithmichelle1@gmail.com. Until next time, let's have some real talk.